Okay, well, while we're waiting for people to come in, we might just get started. For those of you who don't know me, I am Lisa Higgins, and along with Nung Nim, am co-chair of the ACTA Health Economics Alongside Trials Group. And we're thrilled today to have Professor Kim Dalziel presenting a webinar to us on conducting economic evaluation alongside paediatric clinical trials, special considerations and examples. Before we begin and before I hand over to Kim, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we live, work and meet today, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. For me, that is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here with us today. So just a couple of housekeeping things. Please make sure that you are on mute. Please use the chat function or raise your hand for any questions. There will be a recording available on the ACTA website, and we would really appreciate people completing the post-webinar survey that will be distributed after Kim's talk. So I'm sure Kim needs no introduction to anyone online with us today, but Kim is the Chair of Health Economics in the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne. She leads the Child Health Economics Unit and a program of research in child health, and she's got specialist expertise in economic evaluation and modelling, health technology assessment, health-related quality of life measurement and evaluation, and economic evaluation alongside clinical trials. And she also co-leads the Health Services and Economics Group at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. So thank you so much for your time today, Kim, and I will hand over to you.
No problem. Thank you for the introduction. Okay, are you seeing my slide now?
Yep, that's perfect.
Perfect. Excellent. Thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to share a few of my thoughts. I could talk about this all day, so it's really nice opportunity for me. So I've been working in the area a while, and I guess I've started my career working predominantly on cost effectiveness analyses and a little bit of health technology assessment. And I didn't really come to child health until a little bit later. So it wasn't until I joined the University of Melbourne in 2013 that I started working in the area of paediatrics, and that's been my main focus since that time. And I guess I'm part of a group of health economists, Melbourne Health Economics, where we tend to take different specialty areas. So just highlighting there on my slide a few of the other specializations that I work across, and these intersect all the time as well, which is really nice. So here's, I just counted them up a couple of days ago. So at the moment, I think I'm an investigator on 33 paediatric trials. So here's a list across the areas, and I'm not super specialized about which area I would support a trial in. So there's quite a wide range here. We have a lot like in neonatal and prematurity, quite a few in childhood allergy, and then a whole range of quite a few in emergency department as well, and then lots of other bits and bobs. And these are pretty traditional trials, so they're mostly multi-centre. They're all academic-led, all NHMRC or MRFF funded. These are all paediatric. Quite a lot of them are multi-country, which brings new challenges for the economic evaluation. And we're starting to support a few paediatric adaptive platform trials as well. So this, I'm sure I'm speaking to the converted here, but the value of economic evaluation that I've found to paediatric trials is that the trials themselves are widely recognised, and the economic evaluation is now widely accepted and perhaps to the point of expected by our funding bodies. And I find that the people I'm collaborating with in paediatrics really value the way that the economic evaluation can help with translating into policy relevant metrics and really facilitating with that efforts around translation and dissemination. A major advantage for me is that we gain from the rigor of the trial. So all the efforts from our statisticians and our trialists to set up the causal design in a really rigorous way, we benefit from in terms of being able to take that effectiveness estimate forwards into the economic evaluation. It also makes it, I think, quite timely, because if we compare the if we compare the economic evaluation with the paediatric trial, we can get our cost effectiveness evidence out almost the soonest we possibly could following the trial. And it also pushes us towards specifying a lot more of our design choices for the economic evaluation a priori, because that's, we can't obviously specify everything a priori, but at least some of our key decisions are pushed that way as part of trying to align with the design of the trial protocols and analysis plans. Other benefits, I think, is that the linked data, like we can consent the families to their children's data being linked and potentially the parents' data being linked right at the time that they're trialing, consenting to the trial, which is a major advantage. And then that linked trial data can be used for other purposes than the economic evaluation. And also we can continue to follow up that linked data beyond the economic evaluation, which is really helpful. And we provide a bit of insurance policy for if the trial were to fail. So we still have quite a lot of measures around things like linked data, quality of life, adverse events, health state costs that are publishable and useful, even if the trial were not successful. And I think through working with the clinicians, it's been a two-way capacity building benefit. Like we've learned a lot about pediatrics and about all the pediatric conditions and about trials. And I think that we've been able to teach a little bit about economics along the way as well. And I think also we can demonstrate, once we get to the end of our economic evaluation, it's only a small step further to demonstrate a budget impact, which really helps with understanding the potential uptake and economic impacts of funding the intervention after the trial. So I just wanted to point to a few limitations before I get to my examples. And I think my examples will highlight some of these as well. Obviously, we know the biggest limitation of taking a randomized trial through to a policy decision is the generalizability. And a few of my examples, I'll highlight ways in which we've really had to craft our pediatric economic evaluations to orientate towards the greatest amount of policy and practice relevance. And often we find really, and you'll see this in my examples too, that we're really not powered in the trials for the cost effect, for the quality of life data or the cost data. And so we're often, lots of my examples, you'll see that we're finding no difference in within across the treatment groups in quality of life within the trial period. We've got short time horizons of the trial. And again, you'll see in some of my analyses, the types of choices I'm making about where to truncate the analysis and when to draw on other literature assumptions to extend the time horizon of the economic evaluation. We have protocol-driven resource use, which sometimes doesn't match what the resource use would be in real life. And I also will highlight through a couple of my examples that some of these pediatric primary outcomes are difficult to translate into meaningful economic evaluation outcomes. And the comparators in the trials, often where there's a clinical interest in really understanding the cutting edge of where interventions are performing, but that can mean putting two pediatric interventions head to head that are both new options. And sometimes we don't get the usual care comparator in the perfect format that we would like for showing what the impact of the intervention is relative to what's already occurring. And sometimes we're testing a high resource option of an intervention. I've got one example like this, where when, it's kind of dosed up in a way for a trial to give it the maximum chance to show an effectiveness result, but it's really not intended to be taken forward in such a high resource option. So I'll show you one of my examples of these as well. All right, so I've got, across the examples that I'm going to show you, mostly I have no more than 2 years of follow-up data. I've got a broad range of different intervention types. Some of my analyses are linked to Medicare data. For pediatrics, I'm tending to get the hospital data directly from the pediatric hospitals, rather than going through a data linkage for those costs. And the reason is that many of the interventions you'll see that I've got, we wouldn't be expecting the children to go back anywhere other than their paediatric hospital. They have quite highly specialized conditions. So sometimes I'm using microcosting of most of the interventions. I have used time in motion for a couple of economic evaluations in the past too, to understand the true costs of conducting the intervention. The caregivers lost time from work or usual activities that's my number one thing I'm asking for if I get a place to ask for an extra question in the trial survey. Because from experience, I'm finding that the parents' productivity is the largest additional cost that we can insert. It trumps a lot of the other things we might ask for in terms of cost to patients or families. Sometimes we're looking at children's days lost from schooling as well. That's another one that we've inserted in some of our trials. How I approach the economic evaluation for these paediatric trials is I firstly look to the primary trial outcome, and I try to understand whether I think there's meaningfulness in that outcome, or whether it needs to be reframed. Sometimes it's quite a continuous outcome, or it might be a contain multiple outcomes within the one outcome. So sometimes I'm dichotomizing it to establish clinically meaningful thresholds within that outcome for the economic evaluation, in a way kind of creating health states. But sometimes I've had a strong reason for a secondary outcome being a more concrete policy relevant outcome for the economic evaluation, and then I've pulled that in as well. Usually I'm also trying to present a cost per quality as well. And quality of life, I will take it whenever I can get it. So, and if there's a logic to an impact on the carers, which often there is, then I would be asking for the quality of life of the carer as well as the child. So my first example here is the Hipster trial. So this was for preterm infants. It's in tertiary NICU type settings, and it was designed for hospitals that were tertiary centres. And it wanted to compare, at the time, it was a new intervention of high flow therapy for primary respiratory support compared to the existing therapy, which was CPAP. The main trial here was published in New England, and the results, this is just a snapshot of the abstract. The main result of the trial, it was highly successful because it reached its adequate power to show superiority of the intervention before finishing. So we had 25.5% treatment failure in the high flow group compared to 13.3% treatment failure in the CPAP group. So that was the main clinical finding from the trial. And then basically it said the conclusion was that high flow resulted in significantly higher rates of treatment failure than did CPAP. So it's quite a strong trial result to say that if we were to use high flow, then we'd end up with more treatment failure, so which would not be a good thing. The cost effectiveness was super interesting. So what ended up happening is we had to really understand from the clinicians, like, how would these infants receive these therapies in real life? And what it came to our understanding was that in the trial, if a child or an infant failed high flow as the new intervention, then they would be rescued with CPAP as a backup therapy. So there was, like, in a sense, a crossover occurring in the trial. And you could understand that if you're introducing a new therapy and you want to ensure the greatest amount of safety in the trial. Whereas the other group of CPAP, if they failed, then there was no further respiratory primary support options other than going back to now mechanical ventilation, which is quite a serious intervention at that point. So And then it came through talking with the clinicians, we understood that there could be different ways that this therapy would be used in real life. So you might have tertiary centres who would always use high flow with the option of a rescue CPAP backup, right? So that's one scenario. But then there were other centres like secondary centres or even when we looked internationally, centres that were thinking about building up respiratory support that may not have the infrastructure of the CPAP backup available to begin with. Now, from the trial data, we have data to inform each of these scenarios, like what would have happened with and without the crossover by truncating at the point of the crossover. So what we decided to do for the economic evaluation to maximize its policy relevance was really to model both. So we would model what is the cost effectiveness of high flow if rescue CPAP was available and if it wasn't available. And so you can see here the two cost effectiveness acceptability curves for with and without the CPAP backup being available. So it's really taking the trial data and trying to maximize how it could be useful for implementation, policy, and translation. What we found as a conclusion here, let me make sure I tell it to you correctly. I've lost my slide, yeah? There we go. So basically what the conclusion ended up being was that in units with both modes available, using high flow as the first line therapy might be acceptable from a cost effectiveness perspective if there was rescue backup CPAP available. However, if centres were only wanting to adopt one modality, then they should stick with CPAP. And I think that's reasonably consistent with the main trial finding as well. All right, so then what were the specific considerations here? I guess as I've just explained, it's the need to have modelled a real life comparator for this intervention. And so we ended up modelling two scenarios that we felt would best match real life. And the other specific consideration we made was that the primary outcome of the trial was treatment failure, which was like a composite of oxygen intake levels and intubation and ventilation all mixed together. And we felt like that combination of outcomes was harder for a policymaker or a funder to interpret. It's more of a composite outcome. So we moved to ventilation avoided, which is essentially if you fail everything, that's where you end up, as the main outcome that we modelled for the economic evaluation. All right, next example is PPOET 3. So here's the main trial. This is a childhood allergy intervention. So it's for children who have a peanut allergy, and the new therapy is, there's two new therapies essentially that are being compared in this trial. So it's probiotic peanut oral immunotherapy and oral immunotherapy are the two new therapies. And they were compared with placebo in a multi-center randomized trial. Now, what we saw here is it gets tricky because placebo is not the same thing as usual care. So what happened is the placebo group tended to do a little better too, and they didn't behave exactly like what we would expect a usual care group to behave in this trial. So the main result here from their abstract was that we could see that 46% of children in the PPOET group and 51% of children in the oral immunotherapy group achieved sustained unresponsiveness compared to 5% of children in the placebo group. So it's a fairly strong treatment difference, but not very much difference between the two new options, which was PPOET and OIT. All right, so for cost effectiveness, here's the paper here, and thank you to all of the co-authors that contributed. This came from Adam's master's project, supervised by Lee, so thank you to their efforts. And here's the main cost effectiveness results. So we modelled two main outcomes for the cost effectiveness. One was cost per year of remission gained, and the other was cost per quality adjusted life year gained. And there's some quite interesting differences we found between those two. So firstly, when we start on remission, there was so little difference between PPOET and OIT. It sat so close to that middle joining place in the cost effectiveness, the point of origin in the cost effectiveness plane, that we just that we didn't calculate an ISA, and the ISA jumped around a bit because right near that point of origin, you can switch between quadrants quite easily with not much happening. So mostly OIT was cheaper and better and dominant, but really very little going on between the difference between PPOET and OIT when we looked at cost per remission gained year of remission. But when we moved to cost per quality, something different happened. And what this was driven by was the adverse events. So children who were receiving the probiotic version of OIT had less gastrointestinal events, and that drove a difference in the quality of life for these children, which led to PPOET having a cost per quality gained of 8,900. So that once we brought the adverse events in via the quality of life, that result changed a little. And then we had to do a little bit of work to turn placebo into no treatment, because really no one's going to roll out placebo in real life. So that didn't feel very relevant to be focusing on from the point of view of maximizing policy relevance and funding decision making. So we reconstructed a no treatment comparison group here as well. And PPOET compared to no treatment looked cost effective under cost per quality of 50,000, but OIT versus no treatment not just above that threshold. So specific considerations here, the quality of life data was quite tricky because the quality of life was, as you would often find in a trial, it was collected through a disease-specific allergy measure, which was the FAQ-LQ. And we had a few choices with this. Firstly, we could choose to score it according to a preference-based algorithm that had been designed by allergy specialists, but that algorithm was scored with the preference weights generated from a patient population, and we felt like that perhaps wouldn't align with the perspective that would be most strongly desired by decision makers, who would usually make funding decisions on the basis of social preferences. So we opted to map it to the AQOL-60. There's a published algorithm, so we could generate social preference weights for that. And really, whichever way we did it, we were still able to show this difference in the gastrointestinal adverse events for PPOET being more favourable. And this is where we could use sensitivity analysis also to look at alternatives. We obviously needed to construct the policy relevant comparator group. And here, essentially, we were lucky because we have a strong logic and epidemiological data for these types of allergies to show that very few children become cured from a peanut allergy through natural history and time. So essentially, we constructed the no comparator, the no intervention group, no treatment group, based on assuming that baseline values for the trial groups would continue with no change over time. The other issue here we had to think about quite carefully was the appropriate extrapolation of the time horizon, because this sustained unresponsiveness by nature as a primary outcome is a long-term outcome. It means that that child has been assessed as now being able to tolerate peanuts. And you know, it's a soft cure, like, so it's expected that sustained unresponsiveness is sustained. So we would have been underestimating cost effectiveness to restrict the analysis to the point of the 2-year follow-up alone. So obviously we ran different scenarios and sensitivity analysis for this, but for the base case, we modeled 2 years follow-up data, which was available to us. And the children were an average age of 6 when they entered the trial. So now plus 2 years of follow-up, they're up to average age 8. And how long do we model this sustained unresponsiveness? Like if we were modeling an add-on intervention, we might model the life course, right? But what we felt like here is conservatively, we felt like we could be confident in the sustained unresponsiveness to the end of childhood. So we chose a 10-year time horizon as our base case, which takes us to the end of childhood or average age 18. And we weren't confident what would occur developmentally and other changes and if that might interact with the allergy sustained unresponsiveness. So we stopped at that point. And this is a big issue for paediatric trials because that decision of how to extrapolate, you've got to decide whether or not you feel like your extrapolation may hold across these developmental milestones. And in addition, like modeling the full life course for a childhood intervention, at some point, probably around 40 years, you'll end up with you've discounted away all your costs and benefits anyway. So full life course time horizon is usually, you could say it's life course, but nothing's happening beyond a certain amount anyway due to discounting. So for this, I think it's not an unreasonable approach to model out to the end of childhood as your first step. Next example is the choice trial. So this was the effectiveness of 2 intravenous antibiotics, and the difference for this trial was whether they were administered at home versus in hospital for children with cellulitis. So they present to emergency and then they get put on the drip, and that can keep them in hospital several days. Obviously, keeping children in hospital is severely disruptive to families' lives and parents' work and lives, whereas there might be some benefits to having that child back at home and closer to home in terms of being back near the caregiving networks and disrupting the family's life less. So I guess they were some of the questions we went into this trial with. The main result of this trial was that treatment failure occurred in 1% of children in the home group and 8% of children in the hospital group, and fewer children treated at home rather than in hospital had an adverse event, 2% versus 11%. So for cost effectiveness here, we really spent quite a lot of effort designing how we would understand the costs to the family. So we included items like the costs of the parents' time off work for both parents, the costs of their travel to the hospital, the cost of any accommodation near the hospital, and any out-of-pocket expenses related to the child's treatment and follow-up. So here we can see the home group versus the hospital group. There was an $1,800 difference in the cost of their hospital stay, and that was clearly the largest cost, which is what we would have expected. The cost to the families, however, though, there was a $400 difference in costs incurred to families in favour of the home group, which is not we felt like that was a meaningful amount of costs incurred by families to be including in the analysis. We had the treatment failure rate straight from the trial in this case, and then we had quality of life, which was another hypothesis that we thought that families at home may have a higher quality of life. What ended up happening here was, yes, within the trial period, the families at home had a higher utility with a difference of 0.11, which would usually be meaningful, but this is such an acute intervention that the children are only in hospital for a couple of days to receive this treatment, that when you multiply the utility values by the length of time that's relevant to the intervention, it's all over quite quick for infections, then the quality difference ended up like quite small at 0.0006. So really this analysis was mainly about the costs, right? Like is the thing that became most important. The cost effectiveness plane on the right, you can see even with all the simulations to simulate the distribution of the data, the vast majority of these simulations fell in the dominant box, so that the treatment of the child at home with intravenous therapy dominated treating them in hospital. So that was a pretty strong result and led to some nice dissemination for the clinicians and advocating for this to become more of a standardized model of care. And we were able to do a budget impact analysis for this too, which showed that hospitals could save 4 million a year nationally, and families could save 1 million a year just in the treatment of cellulitis, right? Which raises other questions about which other pediatric conditions could this model be helpful for. All right, so special considerations for this particular trial was like the I think it's this issue around acute interventions that we're not able to really, even if there is a difference in health-related quality of life, it matters fairly little in the overall economic evaluation. Here we use the CHU9D to measure the children aged between 6 months and 18 years. So you're using a combination of ways to gather that data, like self-report, proxy, the guidance notes for under 5, all measured within 48 hours of admission to ED, and then again at day 14. The life years were constant, which was 2 days on treatment, 14 days follow-up, and it made the QALY small. The family costs were important. And here you can see, this is taken from the paper, the highest cost incurred by families was attributed to absence from paid work for a mean duration of 0.7 days lost from work in the home group. 0.7 days were lost from work in the home group versus 2 days lost from work for parents of children in the hospital group. And I will say, like, there's a pattern across the pediatric trials that I've seen, that out of all of these types of out-of-pocket costs and costs to families that you might consider, productivity will, in every example I've seen, has dominated. So if you only have room to measure one thing for a pediatric trial, measure the parents' time lost from paid and unpaid work. And we measured paid and unpaid, and I would value unpaid work using like at least minimum wage. All right, the next example is Bell-PIC. So this is a drug treatment for children that present to emergency with Bell's palsy, which is the paralysis of their face. Once again, most children with appropriate treatment, this all resolves pretty quickly, but there's then just a very small number of children that have a really ongoing issue. Here's the trial result. So the proportion of patients who recovered their facial function was 49% in the prednisolone group compared to 57% in the placebo group. And then at 3 months, so that's the short-term result, at 3 months it was 90% recovery in the prednisolone group versus 85% in the placebo group. So you can see here there's a really strong natural history of recovery even without intervention, but there was a small advantage to the new prednisolone group treatment. So cost effectiveness here, this was quite an interesting one. So it was specified by the trial that they would subgroup a priori specified into those children below 12 and those children 12 to 18. And I guess the clinicians felt that the drug may respond differently based on the age of the child. And I guess it's related back to the biology of the condition too and how it's presenting. So they split their results above and under 12, and so did we. And what we actually found was, you can see here that children above 12 years had a much more cost-effective result than children under 12 years, which was quite interesting. So overall, the ISA was 6,600 per QALY gained, and that dropped to 1,500 per QALY gained for older children, but it was up to 31,000 per QALY gained for younger children, which all of those would be considered cost effective. So special considerations here relate to health-related quality of life across child age. So we've got a mean age of 9 to 10 years, but we've got children right down to toddler up to 18. So we've got a full range of child age represented in the trial. So the trial measured using the CHU9D and the PEDS-QL. The really tricky part was the children who were in that 2 to 4 year age range. And in this trial, what we did to generate their utilities, we used the PEDS-QL scores and mapped them to the CHU9D for that age range. And then for the over 5, they had their CHU9D scores. And then obviously you've got another thing going on, which is under 5 is parent reported, over 5 is self-reported by the child. We had a bit of missing data here too, which could relate to the complexity of the trialists trying to piece together how to appropriately measure this for each type of child and family. So there's multiple things happening with the quality of life in this trial. Like we've got the increased recovery rate is obviously sitting underneath. So there were greater recovery rate in children who were older, but we also had a different method of quality of life measurement from CHU9D and PEDS-QL, a different value sets for each. One's mapped, one's direct. So it's sort of trying to think about what we ended up doing was quite a lot of sensitivity analysis of using this quality of life data different ways to make sure that it wasn't the methods of the quality of life that was driving the difference in cost effectiveness between the two groups. And I guess after quite a lot of investigation and testing it different ways with different instruments, different scoring, and some imputation, we were satisfied that the result really was being driven by the recovery rate and not an artifact of the quality of life methods. But it's something to watch, particularly when you've got trials that are crossing across the child age groups like this one was. All right, so here, just a slide that summarizes, I guess, what can go on with quality of life across child age. So across the bottom here, we've got child age. So it can go from birth, obviously, right up to 18 or beyond. I've just demonstrated this graph with the EQ5D as an example, but the same principles apply to other instruments. So the first thing that happens in the purple is we get different instruments for different ages of children across that across childhood. So at each point, like where I've got a red exclamation mark, is a point where there's something methodologically shifting that could be causing a difference in quality of life. The other thing that happens is in the yellow is that we switch at some point from proxy to self-report. And that's another methodological difference, which can cause a difference in the values of quality of life we generate. And then in green, at the same time, we often switch value sets. And that's another point at which we can be imposing a difference on the estimates independent of what the underlying health state is. So I think there's quite a lot of testing we need to do to make sure our methods are not driving the changes. And something like self-report and proxy, the amount of difference in quality of life generated can be equivalent to an effect size that we would see in a trial. So we've really got to watch this in paediatric trials. Last example here is strengthening care for children. So this was a model where paediatricians were put out into general practice as a way to strengthen the general practitioner's ability to care for children in general practice instead of having to refer them back to tertiary centres. So the main results of this study were that patients were referred to hospitals 2.3% of the time in the control group and 1.9% of the time in the intervention group. And there were some pre-specified subgroup analyses to try to understand how this could be rolled out into real life practice for Australia. So for cost effectiveness here, we only report a net cost. So it's the costs of running the intervention, which is the paediatrician and the training and supervision, versus the costs incurred from the referrals and the onward referral to hospital and specialist treatment. So the base case analysis here showed that the new model of care added $2.94 to each additional GP paediatric visit. But obviously from the pre-specified 3 scenarios up the top, it was clear that the intervention would become cost saving if it could be targeted to those GPs that are high referrers to hospitals, or if the family costs were included from a societal perspective, or if the intervention were targeted on low income families. Special considerations here was that really there was so much work to align this to what the policy needs would be for the decision of around how this would roll out, like and the scenarios in which it would be rolled out in real life. And we worked on a lot of those subgroups and extra analyses. All right, so I wanted to give you just a little bit more information on quality of life from some of our research. So this comes from the Australian Paediatric Multi-Instrument Comparison Study that we ran, which was 6,700 children measured for their health-related quality of life using a lot of different instruments. So here's the key findings from many papers and work that we did on this understanding the psychometric performance of children's quality of life measures. But here's the key takeaways. If it's a general population of children 5 to 18 or mixed, so across our whole sample of 6,700 children, some with conditions, some without, the EQ5-DY5L and CHU9D performed the best. In children with mental health challenges, the CHU9D performed the best. And in children with a range of, sorry, I have an update here that hasn't come through, but in children with a range of chronic health conditions, the most consistently well-performing instrument was actually the PEDS-QL. In younger children, aged 2 to 4, we've got options around the CHU9D with guidance notes, EQ5-DY adapted, and now the EQ tips. And also in parents of children with health conditions, we only tested the EQ-HWB, but it performed well in measuring the parents' quality of life. And a few new developments coming in health-related quality of life. There's a new value set available for Australia for the CHU9D for children under 5 years, and that's the first paper I've given you there. There's also now there's 2 short new descriptive systems for the PEDS-QL. There's one with 4 items and one with 7 items that are undergoing value sets right now. So anyone starting pediatric trials will be able to use the PEDS-QL for generating utilities by the time you start a new trial. The ICECAP child and youth measures are coming through, which are capability measures. They're currently available for age 6 to 11 and 11 to 15. And they are quite good in samples where there's sensitivity to deficit-based language for quality of life instruments because they're framed in a positive language. There's also, I know a lot of health services are using the PROMIS, and we have released a mapping algorithm now for the PROMIS Paediatric 25 measure to the EQ5-DY so that utilities can be generated from the PROMIS. And I think I always think about, is consistency in measurement across child age important? If so, then measures like the PEDS-QL have a lot to like. And I know, obviously the Euroqual group are doing a lot to understand the transitions between their different instruments for different ages as well. All right, the other thing I just wanted to leave you with was pharmaceutical data for children. And this is a study that we did where we measured children's hospital costs in the different categories. Each category is a colour before and after the child transitioned from a paediatric hospital care to an adult hospital care. And this is really children who are needing this ongoing specialist care. And the main thing that we found here, if you look at the green line, the highest costs for these children as part of their care is their pharmaceuticals. And it's lower before they transition. So their pharmaceutical care costs are lower when they're in the care of paediatric hospitals, and it gets higher when they move to adult hospitals. And when this is just about to come out, but when we dug into this, what we think is actually happening is it's really just that the paediatric hospitals are paying for the drugs. So because a lot of the restrictions on on drugs specify that the patient has to be an adult, then children are cut out from the restrictions of many PBS pharmaceuticals. So just be aware that if you're PBS linking your trial, you're probably going to be missing quite a lot of specialist medications for children, which are being paid for and scripts administered directly from the paediatric hospital pharmacies. So you'll be underestimating pharmaceutical cost. All right, the other thing is just productivity here. Obviously, I've mentioned productivity already, but there's quite a lot of emerging interest in the costs of children's time. And there's a couple of papers here I've highlighted for you, but there's thinking that we should be including children's time in economic evaluations. I think it will probably become the second most important variable in family costs behind parents' productivity. Some of the new approaches are using contingent valuation, and I've seen one study that's asked children to do the contingent valuation, and that comes up with super small estimates about the value of the children's time, which I think is unsurprising given that children probably don't have a large concept of the value of money yet. One of the things I've been defaulting for in the interim while this research is emerging is the costs to educate a child. So I've looked up the public statistics in Australia about how much a day of public schooling costs per child, and it's approximately $565 per day. And I guess my premise is that if education wasn't worth that much, we wouldn't be publicly investing in it. So that seems like a reasonable minimum to me. And it will, at the moment, it's giving higher values than the contingent valuation tasks. So just a couple of thoughts on that. So conclusions, I think many of us are seeing that economic evaluation has transitioned from popular to essential, and there's definitely appetite for it in the paediatric space. The paediatric clinicians have been really engaged with economic evaluation. I've found that, every variable counts. So I've spoken quite a lot about my thoughts around what I'm prioritizing if I get a chance to collect things. The importance of positioning for implementation and policy translation right at the onset of your design, leveraging the rigor of the trial, and then the relative advantages of linked data, but understanding the nuances of that for pediatric populations. And just a thank you to all the trials that have included me and my team and all the participants that have made these trials possible. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much, Kim, and just so much in there. Is there anything in the chat, Natalie? Let me just have a quick look at the chat. And otherwise, if people can just raise their hands, if they have any questions. I might just start, Kim. I find the work that you've done looking at, the sort of cut points in age and where your value sets change. Because I have that problem working in trials that recruit pediatrics as well as adults.
Yes, definitely.
And so you're using completely different questionnaires. And so I suppose I hadn't thought about before, like just doing various sensitivity analyses, I suppose is your recommendation to what to do in those situations.
Yeah, and I think, there's a lot we can contribute methodologically to, particularly if you can use two instruments. So for instance, in a trial, you could use the EQ5D adult version with your teenagers and the pediatric version, and then you've got more, you can contribute methodologically to what difference you saw, and you've also got those variables then to test in sensitivity. So I think it's I've kind of taken it as a bit of opportunity to progress the methods at the same time as trying to make sure we've got enough variables so we can explore that impact when we get to our analyses.
Anthony, do you want to unmute to ask your question? Not sure you can. Okay, do you want to pop it in the Natalie? Should people be able to unmute?
It's become possible for me to unmute.
There
Sorry,
we
it was blocked out before, but somebody must have done something in the background to help me. Thank you. Anthony Newell here from UNSW. Thanks so much for a really interesting presentation. It's great to hear about all the ways in which you're using these methods. I just had a question which I thought you might have some thoughts on. One thing I'm always a little unsure about when it comes to these economic evaluation using clinical trial data is how you think about uncertainty. So, obviously there's this sort of sampling uncertainty due to the fact, that you're not collecting millions and millions of people. You have a certain sample size in the trial. And so there's uncertainty around, say your cost estimate or your efficacy estimate. But the true uncertainty sort of might go beyond that, in the sense that there's also choices that are being made about what instrument to use, or when you do a modeling study, you might even explore beyond, say, the 95% confidence interval from a data source, because the true value might go outside of that, even though that's the sort of sampling uncertainty. Just wondered how you think about that. Like, do you generally use the sort of how you think about assessing uncertainty, from a sort of looking at the sampling uncertainty, but then looking at beyond that? Thanks so much.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think that's something all of us doing economic evaluation face. I guess my general approach is that I try to stick as close as I can to the trial to start with, and then I try to add in scenarios that broaden me out from there. And you can see I have deviated even from, there's uncertainty. Imagine how much structural uncertainty I'm introducing through even my choice of comparators and my choice of outcomes, right? Like that's really large uncertainty, those choices. So I think it's starting as close as you can to the trial and then building out to represent how the addition of each new piece of uncertainty could impact the decision. And I mean, sometimes things do and sometimes they don't, right? So you can that's part of the value of what you're then putting forward, is the times in which that will impact the decision, or your ice as well away from a decision point, and you can provide your funder with information that I've tested all these things, and even despite all these uncertainties, the decision's still clear that this is cost effective. But I mean, I take your point. I mean, I'm probably the most worried about structural uncertainty through choices I'm making around choice of outcomes and how I'm constructing comparators and how I'm thinking about extrapolating beyond trial period, those kinds of choices. I think, usually the trial rigor is helping us a lot with the estimate of the effectiveness.
That's great. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Yeah, no, I think I've come to the same conclusion, that often it's these sort of methodological choices that you make that are sort of things, often anyway, not always, but things that can sort of change it from being cost effective to not cost effective. So in some ways they're as important as the sort of parameter uncertainty. Thanks so much.
Correct.
For the thoughtful
I
answer.
agree.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. No problem.
And Kim, can I just ask about under twos?
What was that? Sorry?
Can I ask about under twos and what you do with under twos?
Yeah. So I would say most of our neonatal trials, we've not collected, for instance, quality of life on the children. And you can see that we're relying on constructing a primary outcome with maximum meaningfulness for a potential funder. And sometimes that's the primary outcome and sometimes it's a secondary outcome. But really in those neonatal trials under two, we haven't, I mean, my preference would be to have the parents' quality of life as the priority in under twos. There are ways we can measure infants' quality of life now, like the EQ TIPS is quite a strong candidate for measuring under age 3 and has really quite a good building psychometric validity and value sets that are quite close. So there's a good option for measuring it, but I still feel like probably it's going to be the caregivers at quality of life that will be the larger impact in those trials. So I think, I would like to see more of the caregiver impact reflected. And sometimes we have an opportunity to get that and sometimes we don't, right? Sometimes the neonatal setting is too intense and it's all about the baby and we don't have a chance to grab the parents. So but that's what I'm doing with under twos. And I think really it's that you've got such high healthcare utilization in that space. Usually that's going to be your key driver. And then parent productivity, if we can get at that will be the next most important, I feel.
Yep. Nung?
thanks, Kim, for very interesting presentation. I have a question about I'm interested in how you balance between collecting more variables and a burden on the participant, because I want to put a lot of questions, but if it's too long, then
I've modified my approach quite a lot over time. So when I started out doing these, I really would start with my full list. So I'd have particularly on the, I want the parents' quality of life, the child's quality of life. I want the travel, I want the time off work, I want out-of-pocket costs, and I've simplified a lot as I've gone, because I guess what we saw is you can go to quite a lot of effort to measure a lot of those things, and something like travel, usually, unless there's a logic to why travel would be important to that intervention, which usually that's going to be tiny, right, compared to the costs of the hospitalization and the costs of the time off work. So over time, I have narrowed what I ask for, and I'm pretty tight with, and just conscious that trials are so complex to run, and really the trialists don't want me adding pages of questions. Usually I'm just adding a couple, I'm probably adding productivity and maybe one other thing if there's a rationale, and the quality of life if I can get it. And that's it. I'm really trying to simplify what I ask for, and ask for the things that I think are the very most important to my economic evaluation. But I would change that depending on what it was. So we had one of the neonatal interventions was secondary centres where if the patient failed, they got transferred into a tertiary centre, and then transport was a really big part of that. We costed up the helicopter transfer, the road transfer, the parents' travel time, because it was so central to that particular intervention. But yeah, I've slimmed a lot because I started out measuring everything, and then lots of them don't matter so much.
Okay, thanks very much for sharing.
Yeah, I'm sure the clinicians appreciate it. If we can be as efficient as possible with what we're asking for.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, if there's no other questions, no other hands raised, I'm aware we're about to be at the top of the hour. So huge thank you to Kim for your presentation today. It was absolutely fascinating. Our next HEAT webinar is Jingjing Li, looking at the social value of a childhood quality, revealed preferences from pharmaceutical funding decisions in Australia. So that is on the 21st of April. You can register via the ACTA webpage, go to the events link. There'll also be so Natalie will send around a link to the recording of this, and also please complete the feedback. There is a link in the chat, but we will also provide that as well via email. But really appreciate everything Kim has. John, but I can see you've got your hand up. Is that a quick last question for Kim? Maybe you can't unmute either. Maybe you can pop it in the chat in the last 30 seconds if you're unable to unmute. But Kim, really appreciate it. There's not a lot of us, not a lot of people working in the pediatric space and understanding, in a really complex area, how you're managing that. We really appreciate your time and hope to see everyone at the next presentation. But thank you all. And as always, thank you to Natalie and the ACTA team for their superb organisation of everything. Thanks all. See you soon.